Check the pressure on engine 2.
It's holding steady, Sarge.
Check the manifold pressure lead on cylinder 3.
Looks clear, but the ignition harness is frayed here.
We'll need to replace that before the next run.
Tokyo airspace, early 1945. The air above Tokyo is thin and brutally cold. High-altitude contrails cut white scars across a pale winter sky. Far below, the city lies muted. Darkened rooftops, rivers like black glass, sirens already beginning to wail. Japanese radar operators report what they expect. Heavy bombers. American B-29 super fortresses. Alone, fighter units scramble with familiar confidence. For months, this pattern has repeated itself. Bombers arrive. Fighters climb. Interceptors attack. Losses are heavy, but the enemy comes unguarded. Always unguarded. Then the silhouettes sharpen. Not just bombers. Sleek shapes hold formation beside them. Long wings. Silver fuselages. Tight spacing. Calm discipline at 30,000 feet. Escort fighters. Japanese pilots close in, disbelief hardening into alarm. These aircraft should not be here. No American fighter has ever had the range to reach Tokyo and return. That distance, once an invisible shield, has always protected the homeland. But today the shield is gone. As engine noise fills the sky and gun sights begin to align, a single realization spreads through the defending squadrons. The air war has changed forever, and Japan has just lost its last margin of safety. That moment did not come by accident. It was the result of years of planning, failure, innovation, and desperation that reshaped the war in the Pacific. The air war before the Mustang. By the time American bombers appeared regularly over Japan, the war in the Pacific had already consumed 3 brutal years. Island by island, airstrip by airstrip, each advance paid for in blood, steel, and fuel. For the United States, strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands had always been the ultimate objective. But geography imposed cruel limits. Japan lay more than 1,500 miles from the nearest Allied bases early in the war, far beyond the reach of existing bombers, let alone fighters. That changed in 1944. After costly campaigns across the Central Pacific, American forces seized the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These volcanic outposts were transformed almost overnight. Entire landscapes were leveled. Concrete runways stretched for miles. Fuel farms, hangars, and barracks appeared with industrial speed. From here, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress could finally reach Japan. The B-29 was unlike anything that had come before it. Pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, a service ceiling above most interceptors, and a bomb load capable of crippling entire cities. But power came with vulnerability. The B-29 was fast for a bomber, but it was not invincible. Early raids revealed serious flaws. Engines overheated. Formations struggled to stay tight in the thin air. And most critically, there were no escort fighters that could accompany them all the way to Japan. American planners knew this risk, but there was no alternative. Initial raids began in late 1944, targeting industrial facilities and aircraft factories. Bombers flew at extreme altitudes, often above 30,000 feet, where Japanese fighters struggled to reach them. But altitude brought its own problems. Jet stream winds scattered bomb patterns. Bomb accuracy collapsed. Mechanical failures multiplied. Still, the bombers came. From a Japanese perspective, This phase of the air war followed a grimly familiar pattern. Radar stations detected incoming formations. Fighters scrambled from airfields around Honshu. Interceptors climbed steeply, engines pushed to their limits, pilots trained for short, violent engagements. The bombers had no escorts. Japanese pilots exploited this relentlessly. They attacked head-on, the most dangerous approach, but also the most effective. Cannon shells ripped through bomber noses. Pilots rammed aircraft when ammunition ran out. Losses mounted on both sides, but Japan still believed the homeland could be defended. That belief rested on distance. American fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, were formidable machines. They had dominated skies over Europe and across much of the Pacific. But even with external fuel tanks, their range fell short. They could escort bombers partway, then turn back, leaving the B-29s alone for the most dangerous stretch of the mission. Japanese intelligence noticed this pattern. Interception plans were built around it. Fighters conserved fuel, waiting for the bombers to pass the point of no return, where no escort could follow. The psychological effect was enormous. Japanese air defense commanders believed Tokyo and the industrial heartland remained fundamentally shielded. Damage could be inflicted, yes. Losses were inevitable, but the bombers were exposed, vulnerable, reachable. That assumption shaped every defensive calculation. Meanwhile, inside American command rooms, the frustration grew. Bombing accuracy remained poor. Losses were unacceptable. And without escorts, daylight precision bombing over Japan threatened to become unsustainable. The solution would not come from tactics alone. It would come from a machine, one born of earlier failure, nearly abandoned, and radically transformed by a single engine. That transformation was already underway, thousands of miles away, and it would soon collapse the very distance Japan depended on for survival. The aircraft that changed distance. The fighter that would one day escort bombers to Tokyo did not begin as a revolutionary design. In fact, when the North American P-51 Mustang first flew in 1940, it was considered unremarkable, fast at low altitude, agile, but fundamentally limited. Early Mustangs used an Allison engine. At high altitude, performance collapsed. Power dropped sharply above 15,000 feet, making the aircraft unsuitable for the very missions that mattered most in strategic bombing. For a time, the Mustang was nearly dismissed. The transformation came from an unlikely partnership. British engineers, desperate for a high-altitude escort fighter, proposed installing the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine into the Mustang airframe. The result was extraordinary. With the Merlin, the Mustang became something entirely different. At altitude, it was faster than most interceptors. Its climb rate improved dramatically. And most importantly, its fuel efficiency, combined with internal capacity in drop tanks, gave it unprecedented range. By 1944, the P-51 could escort bombers for more than 1,500 miles. It could fight at altitude. It could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. In Europe, the impact was immediate and devastating. German fighters that once slaughtered unescorted bomber streams were now hunted instead. Luftwaffe losses soared. Pilot attrition became catastrophic. Air superiority shifted decisively. American planners took notice. In the Pacific, the problem was different, but the need was the same. The B-29 required protection not for hours, but for entire continents of distance. Early Pacific fighter doctrine had emphasized island defense and short-range interception. Escort warfare over open ocean had never been attempted at this scale. Yet by late 1944, Mustangs began arriving in the theater. They were based initially in the newly captured Iwo Jima, an island seized at enormous cost precisely because of its position. From there, P-51s could reach Japan. Barely. Every mission was calculated down to the gallon. Fuel loads were exact. Formation discipline was unforgiving. A single navigational error could mean ditching in the Pacific. But the math worked. On paper, the Japanese homeland was no longer beyond reach. This reality clashed violently with Japanese expectations. Their air defense strategy assumed bombers would always arrive alone. Fighters were trained to attack heavy aircraft, not dogfight agile escorts. Aircraft designs reflected this belief. Many Japanese interceptors emphasized climb and firepower over protection and endurance. When Mustangs appeared over Japan, they did not simply add firepower. They invalidated an entire defensive philosophy. For the first time, Japanese pilots faced enemy fighters that could meet them at altitude, match their speed, and still remain with the bombers. There would be no safe window, no moment of exposure, no point at which the bombers became isolated targets. This was more than a technical shift. It was a psychological rupture. The distance Japan had relied on, geographical, strategic, and mental, was gone. And as the escorts closed in beside the bombers, the war entered a phase where survival in the air would depend not on bravery or sacrifice, but on who could adapt faster to a new and unforgiving reality. That reality would now be experienced from multiple angles: human, tactical, technological, and moral, each revealing how profoundly the Mustang altered the skies over Japan. For Japanese pilots, the arrival of American escorts over the home islands was not just unexpected, it was disorienting. Most had trained for a specific kind of war: short-range interceptions, rapid climbs, single, violent passes against heavy bombers. Their education emphasized courage and precision under extreme pressure, often reinforced by a belief that personal sacrifice could compensate for material disadvantage. Now the sky looked different. Instead of isolated bomber formations, pilots encountered disciplined columns guarded by fighters that flew with confidence rather than urgency. The Mustangs did not rush. They held position. They waited. American bomber crews noticed the change immediately. For the first time since B-29 operations began, gunners saw friendly fighters above, below, and alongside their formations. The psychological effect was profound. Crews flew steadier. Formations tightened. Bomb runs became more deliberate. Fear did not disappear, but it was no longer solitary. On the Japanese side, confidence eroded quickly. Interceptions that once relied on predictability now became chaotic. Pilots who expected brief exposure instead found themselves drawn into prolonged engagements with well-armed escorts. Losses mounted, not in dramatic bursts, but in steady, irrecoverable increments. This was not a battle of heroes. It was a battle of endurance, and Japan's pilot pool was already thin. The Mustang altered the geometry of air combat. Earlier escorts had been forced to conserve fuel, limiting engagement time. The P-51 changed that equation entirely. It could range ahead of the bomber stream, sweep for interceptors, then return to position. Japanese fighters no longer had the advantage of surprise. Altitude control became decisive. The Mustangs typically flew slightly above the bombers, converting altitude into speed when diving to intercept attackers. This forced Japanese pilots to abandon head-on attacks or risk immediate engagement with escorts before reaching firing range. Fuel discipline further constrained Japanese tactics. Many interceptors carried limited reserves. Extended dogfights were impossible. Once engaged by Mustangs, pilots often had to disengage prematurely or risk not making it back to base. Escort doctrine also matured rapidly. Mustang pilots were trained not merely to defend, but to dominate. Their role was proactive, deny access to the bombers entirely. This was air combat as systems warfare, not individual duels, but coordinated suppression. Technologically, the Mustang represented convergence. Speed, range, firepower, reliability. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag. The Merlin engine maintained power at altitude. 6.50 caliber machine guns delivered devastating fire without sacrificing ammunition depth. Japanese fighters, by contrast, were optimized for earlier phases of the war. Many lacked armor protection. Self-sealing fuel tanks were rare. Performance suffered at high altitude. Repairs grew increasingly difficult as material shortages worsened. The imbalance widened with each engagement. The Mustang did not win every fight, but it dictated the terms of every fight. And as these technical realities settled into daily operations, their implications extended beyond the cockpit, reaching into command rooms and reshaping decisions at the highest levels of both air forces. Those decisions, and their consequences, form the next set of angles in this unfolding transformation. For American leadership, the Mustang's arrival over Japan validated years of doctrinal debate. Strategic bombing had always depended on air superiority, yet until now, superiority over the enemy's homeland had remained theoretical. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the XXI Bomber Command, was pragmatic to the point of brutality. He judged aircraft, crews, and tactics by results alone. Escort fighters were not a luxury, they were a necessity. With Mustangs available from Iwo Jima, LeMay approved deeper, more aggressive operations. Bomber formations no longer needed to rely solely on altitude for protection. Escort coverage allowed planners to accept greater risk in exchange for greater effectiveness. On the Japanese side, leadership faced a crisis without precedent. Air defense commanders had built strategies around predictable enemy limitations. Now, those limitations no longer existed. Requests for new aircraft, revised training, and fuel allocations arrived too late. Industrial capacity was already stretched. Pilot training pipelines had been shortened dangerously. There was no rapid adaptation available, only improvisation. Japanese pilots were among the first to grasp the truth. Reports filter back after early encounters. American fighters were not turning back. They were staying, escorting, hunting. These accounts initially met skepticism. Range figures were questioned, sightings dismissed as misidentifications. But loss reports confirmed the pattern. Fighters were being shot down far from bomber formations, intercepted before attacks even began. The impossible had become routine. This realization struck at the core of Japanese air doctrine. The homeland was no longer protected by distance or by technical limitations of the enemy. Every future raid would arrive with teeth. Morale suffered accordingly. Air defense is as much about belief as capability. The belief that the homeland can be defended sustains pilots, ground crews, and civilians alike. The Mustang shattered that belief. Cities that once expected bombers to arrive wounded now faced coordinated assaults. The sound of engines no longer meant a single threat, but layered danger from multiple directions. For American crews, the psychological balance shifted decisively. Survival odds improved. Confidence hardened into dominance. Missions that once felt desperate now felt inevitable. This was not merely superiority, it was inevitability. And inevitability leads directly to turning points. Moments where accumulated advantages suddenly converge into irreversible change. That moment came when Mustang-escorted bombers began striking Japan not as experiments, but as a sustained, unstoppable force. When the sky closed forever, the turning point did not announce itself with a single explosion or a named battle. It arrived quietly, in formation orders, fuel calculations, and runway schedules. In February 1945, Mustang-escorted missions over Japan ceased to be exceptions. They became routine. From Iwo Jima, P-51s lifted off hours before the bombers they would protect. Engines strained under full fuel loads. Drop tanks hung beneath wings like lifelines. Pilots knew the margins were razor thin. There would be no reserve. As B-29 formations approached the Japanese coast, the escorts were already there, fanned out, scanning the sky, holding altitude with patient control. Japanese radar stations detected the bombers as expected. Interceptor squadrons scrambled as they always had. Climb profiles were familiar, timings precise. But this time, something went wrong. Before Japanese fighters reached attack position, Mustangs descended on them from above. Not in reckless dives, but in disciplined sweeps. Engagements began miles from the bomber stream. Interceptors were forced to fight early, burning fuel, losing altitude, breaking cohesion. Those who pressed through found the bombers unchanged but now surrounded. Head-on attacks became suicidal. Rear approaches were cut off. Escorts slid into firing position with unnerving calm. 6 machine guns converging at lethal ranges. Japanese aircraft burst into flame or fell away trailing smoke. Within minutes, the interception effort fractured. Bombers pressed on. Over Tokyo, bomb doors opened in daylight under fighter cover that should not have existed. Industrial districts, rail yards, and manufacturing zones came under sustained attack, not as isolated strikes, but as coordinated pressure. Japanese pilots who survived landed shaken. Their reports were stark. Escorts had remained throughout the mission. They had fought, regrouped, and stayed until the bombers turned away. For the first time, Japan's capital had been attacked under conditions of American air control. This was not a raid. It was a demonstration. And as subsequent missions followed the same pattern, again and again, the realization settled across both air forces. The defensive ceiling had been breached, and it would not be restored. What followed was not adaptation, but collapse, measured in aircraft, pilots, and the loss of control over the sky itself. The collapse of the interception system. By March 1945, the pattern was unmistakable. Japanese interceptor units were no longer reacting to individual raids. They were responding to a permanent presence. Every daylight approach carried the expectation of escort fighters capable of staying for the duration. The air battles that followed were uneven not because of courage or skill, but because of attrition mathematics. Japanese fighters climbed hard to meet the bombers, engines straining, fuel gauges already falling. Mustangs waited above, converting altitude into energy with clinical efficiency. Engagements were brief and decisive. Japanese pilots who attempted prolonged fights ran out of fuel. Those who disengaged often failed to return to base. Losses accelerated. More damaging than the aircraft destroyed was the disappearance of experienced pilots. Japan's training system could no longer replace them. Accelerated programs produced replacements with fewer hours, less formation discipline, and minimal gunnery practice. The sky filled with inexperience. American escort tactics adapted in real time. Mustang pilots learned the habits of their opponents. They anticipated climb paths. They attacked before formations could assemble. Japanese fighters increasingly faced combat individually rather than as coordinated units. Over Tokyo, the sense of invulnerability evaporated. The B-29 campaign shifted as air superiority solidified. Altitude profiles changed. Tactics evolved. The ability to escort bombers reliably enabled American planners to reconsider risk assumptions that had once constrained operations. This shift directly preceded the transition to large-scale firebombing, where protection from interceptors allowed bombers to fly lower, increasing accuracy and destruction. Escort dominance made these operations feasible. By late March, Japanese air defenses were exhausted. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Spare parts vanished. Airfields were cratered faster than they could be repaired. The defensive system had not been defeated in a single battle. It had been worn away, mission by mission, under the constant presence of fighters that should never have reached Japan at all. When Mustangs escorted bombers over Tokyo, they did more than protect aircraft. They ended the contest for control of the air. And once that contest was decided, the consequences unfolded relentlessly on the ground below. Losses, ruin, and strategic paralysis. The destruction of Japan's air defense did not produce immediate surrender. It produced something more dangerous: helplessness. By the spring of 1945, Japanese air units around the home islands were operating in fragments. Aircraft were dispersed, fuel rationed, pilots rotated in desperation rather than readiness. Interception attempts became sporadic, often launched more for appearance than effect. Records from the period reveal a stark imbalance. Japanese aircraft losses rose sharply during escort-protected raids, while American bomber losses declined. The asymmetry was no longer temporary, it was systemic. Pilot attrition proved fatal. Japan had entered the war with a highly trained air arm. Years of combat had already eroded that advantage. Now, Mustang escorts accelerated the loss of remaining veterans. Each experienced pilot lost represented not just an aircraft destroyed, but institutional knowledge erased. Factories struggled to replace planes. Aluminum shortages worsened. Engines sat unfinished for lack of components. Even when aircraft were produced, trained crews were not always available to fly them. Below the air war, cities absorbed the consequences. With escort fighters suppressing interception, B-29s operated with increasing freedom. Industrial zones, transportation hubs, and residential districts suffered sustained attacks. Firestorms followed. Infrastructure collapsed. Civil defense measures, blackouts, shelters, evacuation plans proved inadequate against the scale of destruction. Morale declined as civilians realized the capital could not be protected. The psychological impact extended upward. Japanese command faced a strategic impasse. Without control of the air, counteroffensives were meaningless. Naval operations became impossible. The homeland itself was exposed day after day without respite. The air war had become one-sided, and yet the full implications of this imbalance were still unfolding. Escort dominance did not merely enable destruction. It reshaped how the war would end. That realization emerged as American planners assessed the final phase of the campaign, guided by the certainty that the sky above Japan now belonged to them. Air supremacy and the closing of options. By the late spring of 1945, American air superiority over Japan was no longer contested. It was absolute. Mustang escorts flew not as protection alone, but as enforcement. Their presence meant Japanese fighters could rarely assemble in meaningful numbers. Attempts to conserve aircraft for decisive battles failed. Every raid demanded a response, and every response drained what little remained. With the skies secured, American strategy hardened. The transition to sustained low-altitude firebombing campaigns was made possible by escort control. Bombers descended below the jet stream, increasing accuracy and destructive efficiency. Entire urban districts were erased in hours. Transportation networks collapsed under repeated strikes. The air war had achieved its grim objective. Japanese leadership confronted reality without illusions. Without air defense, coastal invasion preparations were exposed. Factories could not operate. Fuel depots burned faster than they could be replenished. The war economy ceased to function. Even kamikaze planning was constrained. Aircraft meant for special attack missions were intercepted before reaching assembly points. Training fields were targeted. Supply routes severed. The psychological toll was total. Air supremacy meant time favored the United States. Every day increased Japan's losses while American strength grew. There was no countermeasure left to deploy, no technological leap waiting in reserve. The escort fighter, once a supporting element, had become a strategic weapon in its own right. By escorting bombers to Tokyo, the Mustang removed the last barrier between American air power and Japan's heartland. What followed was not sudden collapse, but inevitable erosion, measured in ash, silence, and empty runways. When the war finally ended months later, the outcome had already been written in the skies above the capital, long before the final blows were struck. What remained was to understand what this moment meant beyond victory and defeat, how a single aircraft redefined distance, protection, and the future of warfare itself. When distance died, for most of history, distance was protection. Oceans delayed armies. Mountains slowed invasions. Skies, vast and unreachable, offered sanctuary to nations that believed themselves beyond the enemy's grasp. Japan entered the final years of the Second World War holding tightly to that ancient assumption. The P-51 Mustang ended it. By escorting bombers to Tokyo, the Mustang did not simply extend range. It erased the concept. It proved that no industrial center, no capital, no homeland could rely on geography alone once air power matured into a system. Bombers, fighters, fuel, doctrine, working as one. The significance was not limited to Japan. Military planners across the world absorbed the lesson immediately. Air superiority was no longer about defending borders. It was about denying the enemy the ability to exist safely anywhere beneath the sky. The escort fighter, once a subordinate role, became central to strategic dominance. For the men who flew those missions, the moment carried quieter meaning. American bomber crews learned what it felt like to no longer be alone. Japanese pilots learned that courage could not overcome structural imbalance. Both sides understood, in different ways, that the character of war had shifted beneath them. When Mustangs appeared beside the bombers over Tokyo, the war did not end that day. But its direction did. From that moment forward, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Only the cost and the time required to pay it. In the clear air above the capital, silver fighters held steady formation, engines humming with unhurried confidence. Below them, a city braced for impact. Above them, an empty sky offered no refuge, no distance, no escape. That is how the air war over Japan truly ended. Not with a single explosion, but with the quiet certainty that the sky itself had been taken away.